The profession was delighted and the public was shocked.
Extra strong Roman concrete.
Fully hydraulic.
Structural welded connections.
It's the
Structural engineering podcast.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Structural Engineering Podcast. My name is Max.
And I'm Zach.
And this week we're talking with Ron Mayes, one of the founders of the US Resiliency Council.
Yeah, my name is Ron Mayes. I'm a structural engineer edging towards the end of my career. I'm originally from New Zealand, the US in 1972, and have been here ever since.
Ron has had a busy career. To start, he was one of the pioneers of base isolation in the United States. In 2006, he helped to start a rating committee for the Structural Engineering Association of Northern California and chaired that committee for many years. This was the beginning of what we now know as the USRC.
Yeah, so we formed the US Resiliency Council in 2014. So it's been going about 5 years.
Resilience can be a pretty broad term. If you just type it in online, you'll get something like psychological resilience or describing a person as being resilient. But when we're looking at a building, it has a much more specific meaning. And ultimately, to have an effective rating system, it has to have a quantifiable meaning.
When we think of resilience in terms of building performance, it's the ability for it to become a building to become operational or functionally operational after a disaster like an earthquake or a hurricane or a flood. So it's the ability for it to regain its basic functions after the event.
How does your guys' organization communicate this and the advantages of being resilient to building owners and cities?
Well, that's a really interesting question because it first assumes that an owner knows what performance they get with a code-designed building, and they don't, unfortunately. That really is partly on us as a structural engineering profession.
I have to add, outreach is hard. If you search structural engineering outreach online, the results are pretty sparse. But one of the things that comes up is SEAONC, Northern California SEAC. Unfortunately, some of the limited outreach that they can do is to high school students. I mean, this is a good audience, and it's often the only captive audience that you can get. But it'll be a while till these people are homeowners and developers. But there's things that you can do as a designer. Just having those discussions with your clients, even if it bores them to tears, bringing up the concepts that we understand, but that might not make their way across to the architectural side of things.
Most owners and most of the public assume that, quote, they're getting an earthquake-proof building if they hire a good structural engineering firm. And when in fact what we're delivering is a building that's life-safe. And it's very clear in the commentary to all our codes that a code design building should be life-safe, but not necessarily functional after an earthquake. So the whole idea of resilience is to go beyond life safety and to have a discussion with the owner community about its ability to be functional after an earthquake, just life safe. Now, this really came home to many people in the profession when in 2011, I don't know if you remember, but there was a very significant earthquake in Christchurch, New Zealand. The public was shocked to learn after the event that almost 50% of the new building stock had to be torn down after the earthquake. Now, the structural engineering profession was very proud of the performance of the buildings in the earthquake because it had done just as the profession had predicted, that they were life safe. There were only 2 buildings that collapsed and they had some serious issues and shouldn't have collapsed, but had they been designed according to code. So the profession was delighted and the public was shocked. And so what that brought to the fore, this huge disconnect between the public's expectation and what, in fact, we're delivering.
How has Christchurch adopted this idea? You said the public was very surprised when they found out that it acted as it should have, but 50% of the buildings had to be teared down. How is a community like that taking this idea of resiliency moving forward?
Well, what's sort of interesting is it probably, I don't know what percentage of the buildings there now, but a significant percentage of the buildings have all been base isolated because that's sort of the highest performance you can deliver. And I'm aware of like 30 new projects in Christchurch that have all been base isolated after the earthquake.
As you go up the scale in the resilience rating, are there limitations to what sort of force resisting system can be used? You mentioned base isolation is obviously one of the best performing that we have available to us. But if you're looking at a platinum building, are you limited by R or drift or something like that?
No, what we decided to do was to not do anything like that, and what we wanted our profession to do was to embrace the idea of designing better performing buildings and leave it in their hands to look at the different options. There are lots of different technologies and different ways of skinning the cat or designing the building. So, you can lower drifts, you can lower the R factor in design. But essentially what you have to do to reduce the damage and hence get better recovery time, you have to reduce both drifts and the floor accelerations. So we haven't made any limitations whatsoever on different structural systems.
Has it been a challenge getting design engineers to adopt this or to understand how to, I guess, one, sell the value of it, which I think the value is maybe the easy side of it, but it's almost more an economics problem than a design problem up front. Have you found that engineers are able to kind of figure this out? I know this is it's kind of confusing for me, honestly.
The short answer to that is that when we started the US Resiliency Council, it started from nothing. And we decided that if it needed the support of the profession. And so what we decided to do was to go out to the profession and ask people to become founding members. And to be a founding member, you had to make a minimum donation of $3,000 per year for 3 years, and to have one or two of your staff work on our technical committees to finish the development of the rating system. So we ended up with 64 original founding members, and that consisted of 42 structural engineering firms. So we raised over $500,000 to get the organization up and running. And so the structural engineering profession, or certainly the 42 founding members, were all intimately involved with the development of the system and the adoption of it. So, and we had thought or hoped that they would be the ones that would carry it out to the owner community. And they haven't done that to the extent that we would have hoped. I think our profession's always a little gun shy and pushing new ideas out in the marketplace.
Let's kind of dive in a little bit to really what the rating system is for the USRC. To start off, they have a chart here, the USRC building rating system, usefulness of performance metrics. It's broken really into 3 categories: safety, damage, and recovery. Now, within each one of these categories, there's 5 different levels, ranging from 1 star to 5 star. And depending on how your building is rated across those 3, you can get a resilience-based design of platinum, gold, or silver, and then a code-based design of just being certified. What they said is if your building has been designed from a 2000 IBC level or newer, then you can be certified as, your building meets code. And what that really is trying to do is, let people know where their building stands. Obviously, if they don't have a rating, either it hasn't been done or they can't achieve it. So I think it's kind of something important. Quickly to kind of go through this, at the high end, the platinum is 5 stars in all 3 categories. So for safety, blocking exit paths is unlikely. For damage, minimal damage is achieved, less than 5%. And then for recovery, it says immediate to days. So this is a building that's kind of like Ron said, can be used during an event or quickly after event, not much economical loss, if any. And then to go to the other end, the 1 star, On the safety end, you have loss of life is likely, damage, severe damage, 40% or greater, and then for recovery, more than a year. So that's a building that's not doing well at all.
How does the design process look different for a resilient structure, intentionally resilient beyond the code, for a design engineer to really understand, what this leap is? I think part of, spreading information is feeling like you know exactly what that entails for you as the designer.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I'm not sure if you're aware of a project called FEMA P58, but FEMA funded a 12-year, 10-year, $12 million project to develop the ability for software to predict both the damage and the repair time of a building that exists, of a building that you've designed. The software is called PAC, and the project was done by Applied Technology Council. And that software was modified, and it's commercially available, and it was developed by HB Risk, and the software is called SP3, and it's a very user-friendly software that if you've got a building that you're looking at, and it can be done in schematic design, can be done in design development, but you can use that software and take a building that you're looking at and you're making design decisions and run it through that software, and you will get the performance of the building as you're going through the design process. So it can be used to look at 3 or 4 different structural systems and how they compare performance-wise, or it can be used and has been used once you've decided on a structural system, how to then improve its performance. So you go through, as part of the design process, you are utilizing this software to assess the performance of the building you're designing. So there's a new piece in the process. So you're not just buying code requirements, you're then assessing the safety, damage, and downtime components of that building as it exists, as you're designing it.
I have a question that kind of came up in the beginning when you're talking about life safety. Do you know the history behind how we got to the performance objectives that we're at currently, thus, being life safety, rather than looking at the approach of building code as resiliency?
Well, that's a really good question. I think our building codes sort of grew up, in the 70s. We had a big earthquake in Southern California in 1971, the San Fernando earthquake. And the building codes have sort of made some significant changes after each major earthquake. We had the steel moment frame problem in the Northridge earthquake in 1994. And there was major changes to the design of steel moment frame buildings. But it's always been safety focused. There was no discussion of resilient design in those days because we never had primarily because the tools did not exist for us to be able to assess the performance in terms of how much damage would occur and what the recovery or repair time might be. So it wasn't until this FEMA P58 study, this 10-year, $12 million effort was completed, that we actually had the capability of assessing the performance of buildings. And at the same time that was going on, our SEONC, Structural Engineers Association in Northern California, we were developing a checklist system for developing a rating system based on the ASC 41 checklist. And so there are two ways to get a rating. One is to use the SP3 software or to use the ASC 41 checklist. But there are limitations on how far you can go with the ASC 41 checklist process. So the short answer to the question is that we never had the tools, the software, to enable us to do anything different other than life safety. But the thing that we didn't do as a profession was communicate that.
For someone that's new to the field of engineering, are there ways to be involved before you're licensed?
Yeah. I think the biggest issue for this to take off is for us, and that means all of us, the student community, the new professionals, is to start talking to clients, to colleagues, to family members, to anyone about resilience and about what a code design building is and what this new sort of concept of resilient design is, because we've sort of got to get widespread acceptance by the public or bring the public up to speed on, we can now look at resilient design that we weren't able to do 20 years ago. So anyone involved in the profession needs to be part of that outreach effort, as it were, including you guys within your design firms.
Living in Salt Lake, there's a lot of old unreinforced masonry, brick masonry homes. And I often, when I'm running around the neighborhood, wonder if people knew, 20 years ago, what they were kind of getting into with something that is not particularly resilient, but also not particularly stable in a seismic event. Certainly designed to a much, much older code and not the greatest system. I know that Salt Lake actually has a fix the bricks sort of program where you can be eligible for a grant to basically remove the bricks from your house if it's brick clad. But yeah, it's an outreach thing for sure.
Well, here's what I sort of fervently believe myself. There's really two ways to upgrade cities, towns, wherever we live. One is by mandates, and that is having cities or states require people to upgrade the buildings they own. Say like in California, we've sort of gone through the unreinforced masonry buildings. And now we've got the non-ductile concrete buildings, and we've got the steel moment frame buildings pre-1990. So we've got a lot of classes of buildings that are really quite vulnerable. So you can either have cities or states mandate requirements for those. It's my personal opinion that it's much better to adopt a rating system and people what the expected performance is. And if you've got a poor performing building, you shouldn't be mandated to have to upgrade it. But you certainly, I believe, have a responsibility to let people, the tenants in the building, know that it's a potentially vulnerable, this is the performance of the whole idea of the rating. And so then let the marketplace decide. So, in New Zealand, where I was after the 2011 earthquake, that they've got a lot of mandates going on throughout the country, and it makes people pretty angry. And a lot of people that own buildings don't have a lot of money. But I think, so you've got to get that balance between informing the people that are going in the buildings and let them make decisions on how much rent they want to pay, and let the marketplace decide. If you're prepared to, as a building owner, do a really good retrofit and get a much better performance, you will probably get more rent.
Yeah. Have you pushed to inform single family home owners about the system? I think, that's a great, a higher transaction market to say that this home has a better performance?
We we've worked on a housing rating system, but we felt like if we can't get the commercial one to work, where people have got more resources and so forth, it's going to be really difficult to get something working in the housing market, because it has to be the system. There's two things with a rating system. One, it has to be credible over the long haul. So you can't have a system that can be gamed. So you've got to think through all those issues. And then, for a home, it has to be relatively inexpensive. And getting an engineer involved in rating a home, how many hours would it take? It's going to take 2 or 3 hours, and you're then up to, depending on the fee, but, trying to do something for less than $1,000 is pretty difficult. And so anyway, we have chosen at this point not to try and get into the housing market. So ours is just applicable to commercial construction.
So how does one become a certified rating professional, and what really is the requirements of their qualifications?
The requirements for and again, this gets back to the credibility issue and being sure that people that are doing the rating are appropriately qualified. You first need to be a registered engineer, so you have to have a professional license, and then you have to have 5 years of additional design experience after registration. And in addition to that, you have to take an example and go through the two different acceptable methods of rating a building to demonstrate your competence that you're able to follow the requirements. So it's really a 5 years after registration, and then you can become a certified rating professional.
Are there any design practices that you'd recommend to make your day-to-day designs more resilient, assuming the owner is not interested in going through a rating system, or say this is a residential project? From the design aspect, what is more resilient than other options?
That's a really good question. Some people believe that if you go straight to a risk category 4 design, that you will get better performance, and you certainly will, because it's got lower drift requirements. The problem is with our current code design is that you do not have any requirements to look at floor accelerations. And floor accelerations, the greater the floor acceleration, the more damage to the MEP, the contents, anything that's sort of acceleration sensitive. And in a typical office building, there's probably not a lot, but in, manufacturing facilities, biotech companies, there's lots of acceleration sensitive items in those buildings. So going up to a higher risk category will get indeed better performance. I was at the New Zealand Earthquake Engineering Conference in April of this year, and they had a keynote speaker who's been around. He's sort of my age, in his early 70s, and he was in charge of assessing all the buildings in Christchurch after the 2011 earthquake. And his topic for the conference, he was a keynote speaker, was what did New Zealand need to do to embrace resilient design? And it was interesting. He said every engineer should begin with a base isolated building. And he said if that doesn't work, then go to other structural systems and utilize the SP3 software to assess different design options. So it's really about, reducing drift and reducing floor accelerations. And it's really hard with the only two structural systems that actually reduce floor as you bring down drift, and you do that with a moment frame or a brace frame or a buckling BOP, you stiffen up the system, but the floor accelerations go up. And to bring the only two systems that bring down drift and bring down floor accelerations are viscously damp frames and base isolated systems. So they attack both sides of the equation that you need to, from a design perspective, reduce. So anyway, that was his conclusion. I thought he was right on the money.
We do appreciate the time you gave us to ask the questions. Ron, is there anything else that you'd like to add before we close out here?
Yeah, if this is for for graduating students and new professionals, it's my very strong belief that we as a profession need to become leaders in resilient design. We have the tools that are available to us now, and we have the communication tools to promote resilient design. And I think we cannot take a second seat to anyone because we're the ones that are in control of the design that can become more resilient. So I think we need to have those discussions with the owner, the clients, and the architects, because the architects, if an owner is prepared to spend a little bit more money, they can find 10 ways of doing that. And anyway, we need to have the conversation with the owners about designing better performing buildings and utilizing the rating system as part of that communication tool. Because when you show them what a code-designed building, how it performs, it's really quite a shock. If they might be down for 4 months to 8 months, that's a shock for people, and so we have to have that communication. That's what we're doing, and we can do better than that. And we, as a profession, need to take the leadership role in doing that. Hence, that's why I've spent the last sort of 8 years getting the US Resiliency Council off the ground, because I believe it's a really important issue for our profession going forward. So I think yourselves and the younger members of the profession have got a great opportunity to do something much better than we were ever able to do.
Well, Max, what do you think about resiliency now?
I understand it a little better.
Yeah, I wish, to be honest with you, going into that, I was really hoping that the answer was a lot easier on how to be able to design for resiliency. It kind of is unfortunate, in my opinion, that you have to be able to use the P58 software. We both have experience with ASC 41, and man, that's like some of the most confusing code I have ever read. So I really wish there's a easier way for designers to design for resiliency, but I think, discussing with Ron and really getting to understand what it's all about, I think is the first step. And to really learn, it's really about educating the profession.
Absolutely. And I like the emphasis on community outreach, because it's really the structural engineers that need to inform citizens on the buildings that they're in and the level of safety. There's not another group that's able to do this.
Yeah, totally. I'm actually pretty excited to learn more about base isolation too. I think Taylor Devices podcast, we learned a lot about a damping system, but going to learn about base isolation and trying to understand more of that cost in the future. And I think an upcoming episode would be on base isolation.
Absolutely.
Well, great. Well, thank you for joining us this week. We really appreciate you listening to us. We know you listen to us every week, but some of you aren't subscribed to us. We know you guys all need to tell your friends about us. It would really mean a lot to Max and I. All the emails and messages we get from you guys with questions is awesome. So keep reaching out to us, Instagram, Facebook, email, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye-bye.